Lately to the topics that we're about to discuss tonight, especially asking for guidance and inspiration to our friend Peter um, to talk about this very important topic of Blessed are the Afflicted on, on our lives. Maybe he be inspired to um, convey the thoughts prepared for tonight easily to us, and may we be open to um, to absorb as much as we can of the message that's going to be given to us. So we ask you, dear Lord, to be with us. You've always told us that when two or more are united under your name, you will be with us. So be with us tonight and allow us to begin our studies. So be it.
So be it. Thank you, Lino. And again, welcome, Peter. He has given us a couple of lectures, and today we have the pleasure of welcoming him again. And I see people are still coming in. Luis Antonio, Marcela, Glaucia, welcome everybody. And so Peter, for those of you who may not know him, is first giving us a lecture today on chapter 5, Blessed are the Afflicted. And he has been an active member of the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey for over 20 years. He participates in the Tri-State Spiritist Federation and since 2021 has been appointed Director of Outreach in the United States Spiritist Federation. He has been a speaker in several U.S. Spiritist symposium and contributed to the USSF course Initiation into Spiritism and Introduction to Mediumship, both those courses. And he loves to play the guitar and regularly performs at a New Jersey nursing home. He has a background in um, he has a background in theater as a playwright, literary manager, electrician, and carpenter. So multiple hats, as well as being a spiritist and a speaker. And he's also an author who's published several children's books with his wife, Brazilian author Betty. I'm not going to attempt to say her last name, Rosen.
Rosen's good.
All right,
Rosen's
thanks.
is
Thanks for the help, Peter. Through their company, Sem Fronteiras Press, with publishers in Brazil, Colombia, and the US. And again, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. The floor is yours.
okay. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Okay, let me share this. What role does having afflictions play in our lives? Why do we have to go through afflictions anyway? Sometimes it seems horribly unfair and very sometimes capricious. Well, blessed are the afflicted is based on chapter 5 from the Gospel according to Spiritism, and it is inspired by the Sermon on the Mount, which is chapter 5 through 7 in the book of Matthew. One of the great ways to get a good summary of Jesus' teachings is the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus opens with the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes include some of these. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. If we look at all of these together, they all focus on some kind of struggle that we can be going through at the moment, but they also say things will be better in the future. This implies that there is a future, that whatever we go through now, no matter how overwhelming it might be, it's temporary. And if we look at some of these, blessed are those who mourn and who weep now. There's some similarities in those. But what does it mean really to mourn? Mourn over what? Any number of things. If we are weeping now, what about to be hunger and thirst for righteousness? That implies an emotional hunger of some kind versus who are hungry now. You who are hungry now, it's a kind of, well, it certainly could be physical hunger. It could be some kind of deprivation, some kind of need. Maybe it's a struggle, a huge struggle, maybe not so much, but it's something in which we have to get through this particular moment. And yet, in every one of these, Jesus is saying, hang in there, things will be better. However, everything I just said about things will be better, they can sound outright crazy, even delusional, unless we consider this from the perspective of that we have a future. What does it mean to have a future? I'd like to share with you a couple of general points that I think are essential to following Spiritism and accepting Spiritism. The first one is that we believe in God in some capacity, some kind of higher power, if you will, that we believe that there is a just God and that there is such a thing as God's justice, and that we all operate under the realm of God's justice. The second is that we understand and accept that we are immortal spirits, that we do have a past, present, and future, and where we are right now is just one moment in time upon a journey that is much, much longer. That we believe not only that we're immortal spirits, but that we experience a variety of trials for the purpose of spiritual progress over a long period of time. When we internalize this understanding about the nature of our existence, then the Beatitudes that Jesus says begin to really make sense, because it's ensuring us that there is a reason to go through pretty much everything that we're going through right now. So this presentation, Blessed are the Afflicted, is based on chapter 5, as I mentioned before. Chapter 5 is kind of a big chapter, at times rather dense in a good sense, but it's really very difficult to cover every single point in this chapter. But even so, I want to cover some of the essential parts of this, which includes the justice of afflictions, current and prior causes of afflictions, forgetfulness of the past and what role that might play and why we might experience that. What does it mean to have resignation? What are the reasons for it? What about suicide and madness from the point of view of a spirit that has eternal life? Does it make sense? And then also some instructions from the spirits. These are messages from spirits that are at the end of this chapter. So if we look at the justice of afflictions, and we go back to another important point about Spiritism. I mentioned two essential points, there are of course several, but here's another one. The vicissitudes of life have a cause, and since God is always just, such cause must be just. Sometimes it feels like things happen that are not terribly fair. Sometimes it seems like God is capricious, that God, why do some people seem to have it relatively easy and others do not? Why are some suffering enormous deprivation while others perhaps have wonderful, apparently lives that are somehow glamorous and so forth? And yet we have to understand that everything that occurs for a reason. And this leads to a point that God must be all-powerful and all-justice. Now, this gets into the subject of divine law. Divine law are the laws that come from God. Divine law is these laws come from God, they are unchangeable. And we are all subject to divine law. Divine law is made up of two general things. One is the physical world, which is in the realm of science that scientists can study, and the other is more the moral and intelligence, or the laws that govern the development of our spiritual selves, which have to do with the development of morality and intelligence and so forth. That aspect of divine law also helps to expand upon the intelligent principle. The intelligent principle is a quality or state of being that cannot ever be eradicated. So we are all subject to divine law. If we focus on the current causes of afflictions, there's two general points that lead to the vicissitudes of life. One is that we go through afflictions that are happening in this life, meaning this one life, the life that we're living at the moment. And then there's the other cause of afflictions, which can be outside the current life, this current life. In this instance, one of the points that this chapter makes is that whether we're going through afflictions as a result of the life we're currently living, or as a result of something from our past, often we are the architects of our own suffering. A lot of this chapter kind of focuses on this point in particular, that one way or another, we often make decisions, and in our decision making, we misuse our free will. There are, of course, many reasons for this. Since Spiritism stresses that we are born simple and ignorant, our purpose here is to learn, to go through a number of trials, to make all kinds of mistakes. It's inevitable. And in doing so, we often, as they say, we create our own problems. How do we create some of our own problems? Well, it's normal that we have all kinds of desires, but sometimes we give in to certain desires which can cause us harm. There's our physical desires. There's also emotional desires that maybe are excessive, such as greed, ambition, hatred, inability to forgive, a desire to get even, and so forth. Those are all desires that when we take them, well, they're not desires we should really indulge in the first place, but when we do, they often cause problems for us. What about when we create unions out of self-interest in which our heart is not really connected? In other words, we connect with people not because we truly care about them or because our heart is open, but because we want to see what we can get out of those people. What can I get out of this relationship? How does it benefit me? And then when I no longer see the benefit, I abandon that person and move on. We suffer from diseases and sicknesses, certainly. Sometimes they're hereditary, of course, but there are times when we get sick in some way due to our own intemperance, or we indulge in excesses of all kinds. This theme does come up more than once in this subject, in this chapter, about, for instance, indulging in substance abuse of one kind or another. One of the general points is that we cannot violate any of God's laws without experiencing the consequences. In other words, God's laws, divine law, natural law, are very much about all of us operating within parameters, within boundaries. Just one simple example. If I have an attitude that I'm invincible, and then I go charging off the cliff because I think I'm invincible and I'm full of myself, well, what's going to happen? Gravity will kick in and I'm going to fall. It doesn't matter who I think I am, what my attitude is, etc., etc. I have to operate within those parameters. All of us are constantly operating within limitations. We literally cannot do anything we feel like whenever we feel like it. Sometimes people try, but then the consequences will kick in one way or another. And because Spiritism stresses the immortality of the spirit, consequences can be played out in any number of ways. It could be in the future, perhaps well into the future. So anytime it seems like there's no consequence for things at the moment, we have to, part of what it means to operate and respect divine law is that we will eventually encounter those consequences. However, if we want to avoid them, we might be aware that, oh, I don't want to do certain bad things because I do know I'll have to answer for it later. There's current causes of afflictions, and then there's prior causes of afflictions. This has to do more with our history in some way. How does our past behavior play itself out in the present, especially when we're talking about afflictions? Well, it could be a few ways. There's that old expression, what cards were we dealt? These were the cards I was dealt. And when we think of those kinds of afflictions in that way, it can be related to something that occurred in our past. But there's also another possibility. If we experience the loss of someone who's close to us, it could be at a young age, it could be at an older age, but to experience loss in general is one of those cards that we've been dealt, so to speak. What about the loss of breadwinners in a family? When someone who helped provide for the family is no longer able to do so, and the stresses and the challenges that that imposes. That may seem like a huge disadvantage. And yet, like this next one, infirmities we might have had since birth, especially infirmities that make it harder for us to earn living as adult. This can seem like a very daunting thing to have to cope with. And yet, all three of these so far are experiences that are difficult. They can be the rough cards we were dealt, but it's not impossible for us to be able to get through these as best we can. What about if we have deformities or we suffer from some kind of mental instability? Spiritism stresses that, generally speaking, mental illness from the perspective of an immortal spirit is a trial. It's not a permanent state of things. We may experience mental instability for one life, maybe more than one life. That's a possibility, but it's not forever. Just as a deformity, a physical deformity, is not forever. Children who were born unhealthy and die at a young age. To either be that child or to or suffer the loss of a child. We'll talk more about that a little later on in this presentation. But these, again, are afflictions that can feel like I really got a bad hand of cards. And yet they may be happening perhaps because of things that are consequences of our prior existences. That's one possibility. Another possibility is they might be a test in some way. I'll say more about that in a little bit. But whatever we're going through, if we can really internalize this understanding that every effect has a cause. In other words, whatever happens to us, no matter how difficult it is not arbitrary. In other words, this cause must be justified because God's justice is real. Again, when we're in the middle of an affliction, it can be really hard to accept this. And yet, from a spiritual perspective, from the perspective of an immortal spirit, if we can internalize this understanding about the nature of our existence, then we begin to see afflictions in a much different sense, mainly that it will not last forever and that it does serve a purpose. But also, part of what this chapter focuses on, especially prior causes of afflictions, is that the debts we incur must be paid. It's kind of similar to the theme of action and reaction from Andre Louise. The debt must be paid. For example, one who was cruel and inhuman to others, however that occurs, that person is treated harshly and inhumanely in return. Whatever we do to others, it may be done to us back, especially if we have little or no compassion for how others experience suffering. Those who are very proud will be born into humiliating situations until they learn to be humble. Notice here that it's learn to be humble. Yes, it might feel like punishment. People like to use that word, but the real emphasis here is that whenever we go through a consequence, it is an opportunity to learn. What about those who were stingy or misused their fortune in the past will experience deprivation? It's similar to the next one I'm going to point out in a moment, but it has to do in part with taking what we have for granted. If we were stingy, then we were again unwilling to help others, perhaps in moments where we certainly could have, and we just chose not to. Or we were careless with whatever we had in the material world. What about those who are bad as sons or daughters may suffer similar rebellious behavior from their children? Again, it's kind of that expression, what comes around goes around. And if we were rebellious as sons or daughters, then it happens to us as well. If we're rebellious against our parents and we don't respect them, it's a sign, excuse me, it's a sign that we lack gratitude. And much like squandering riches, for instance, or being stingy, it's not appreciating something that we have at the moment that could be enormously beneficial to us. In all of this, whatever the consequence is, and there are numerous consequences, and how consequences get played out, really, it's everyone's different. Every case is a case, which is how I remember hearing it in my English studies. Everyone's how they experience consequence can be different. There are all kinds of nuances to it. But one thing is constant. God's justice is never interrupted. What does that mean? Well, first of all, we live in a lower order world. Since Spiritism stresses that Earth is a planet of trials and expiations, all of us are here because we need to work on something. We need to learn something. We need to atone for something. We're being given another opportunity to do better. And we may complain about it, and we may feel like this isn't fair, but we exist where we belong. That's part of God's justice that is never interrupted. And well, we may think, I've been studying Spiritism. I really want to advance and I want to, go into a better world. Okay. Well, we advance to more advanced worlds when we choose to behave in more advanced ways. What does this mean? It means that we have free will. Once we develop some consciousness, once we get develop out of that original state of being born simple and ignorant, we start to have more self-awareness. We begin to pilot our own ship, as it were. And at that point, we can begin to decide, am I going to make choices that ensure or likely to increase the speed at which I make spiritual advancement, or am I going to rebel, fight back, be proud, etc., and delay the progress? Regardless of how we understand afflictions, and we understand there is God's justice, one of the things this chapter stresses is that we should be thankful to God that God, in its goodness, grants humans the possibility of reparation and does not condemn it irrevocably on account of a first fault. Since Spiritism stresses reincarnation is essential to our existence, reincarnation is the engine that drives our spiritual progress, if you will, it means that God is giving us a new opportunity to try to get right things that we didn't get right before, to try to learn from our mistakes. We are not condemned forever because we made a mistake, but rather we are given a new chance. And that is something to be very thankful for. And again, it's a way of deepening our appreciation that there is a God, there is a higher power, that there is such a thing as divine law and that there is such a thing as cause and effect. And it's another way of saying, yes, consequence exists and consequences do matter. And if I'm willing to take responsibility, then not only can I increase my spiritual progress a little faster, but I'm also can appreciate the opportunities that come in being able to learn or correct mistakes from the past. Now, we've been talking in part about afflictions as being consequences of the past, but it's important to stress, as this chapter does, that not all afflictions are consequences of our past. Sometimes any atonement always serves as a test, that's true, but a test itself is not always an atonement. Once we develop some awareness in our spiritual progress and we're back in the spirit world and we're trying to decide what we might focus on next, and assuming we're allowed to make certain decisions about the general subject of our next life, some of the things we have to take on as challenges, we may choose to take on certain tests that we didn't necessarily have to take on, but we understand could help us a great deal. Now, we'll never take on anything we can't really handle, but we may be taking on something that perhaps is a little challenging, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't give it a try. And again, a test is not always an atonement. So every affliction we go through is not always a consequence of something that we did. What about forgetfulness of the past? Spiritism generally stresses that although we understand ourselves as immortal spirits, we don't necessarily want or need to know the entire history of our prior existences, especially when we're here on Earth. After all, if we are here on Earth, do we really want to remember our past lives? Well, there may be certain circumstances where that might be beneficial, and it's not forbidden, as far as Spiritism is concerned, to look into understanding a little bit more of our past lives. But for most of us, generally speaking, it's better if we don't. First of all, if we know our entire history, it may be a very heavy thing for us to accept. One thing Spiritism stresses, and I'm sure you've all heard this before, is that we right now are the best we've ever been. That means that we were not so great in the past. And do we really want to live with everything we may have done in the past, especially to someone who may be in our current lives now? Spiritism stresses that our families, for instance, is often made up of spirits that have had a long history together. What if we're trying to work things out with a family member? We need to work on forgiveness. We need to work on reconciliation. But if we knew everything that happened with that individual, it might interfere enormously with our free will. We may have trouble forgiving so-and-so because of what we know they did to us in the past and things like that. So it is better when we don't have the whole picture, as it were. To improve ourselves, God has given us only what is necessary and sufficient. The voice of conscience and our instinctive tendencies, that's enough, taking away anything that could harm us. In other words, it is useful when we operate with limited awareness and perspective, because then we're more free to actually work on repairing, making amends for the past, improving upon relationship now that was rocky in the past, and so forth. And to repeat, knowing too much can, in certain circumstances, interfere enormously with our free will. What about resignation? What is the role of resignation in our lives? Well, one of the points about resignation is that we learn to accept suffering, but we also understand that suffering is not gratuitous for some of the reasons I've mentioned before. That we may not understand exactly why we're experiencing something. In fact, we probably often don't. We may have an instinct about it or an inkling of it, but we don't really know the whole story. But if we accept that it's not gratuitous, then it allows us to accept that suffering does serve a purpose. Now, this may sound a little peculiar, but it says you must consider yourself happy to suffer because your pains in this world are the debts of your past faults, and these pains, if endured patiently on earth, will spare you centuries of suffering in future life. This is not suggesting that we should enjoy suffering or become masochists, for instance. That's really not the point. The point is, if we see an opportunity to maybe speed up our spiritual progress or overcome certain debts that we know we're going to have to answer for somehow, because it's inevitable we all have debts. If we know that we can make certain choices and maybe go through an experience that's unpleasant, that we might go for it. It's like the patient that's willing to take the medication with the side effects when the patient knows that they will truly be better off at the end of it. I'm going to give you a kind of somewhat silly, but an example that also makes the point. Let's assume you are buying a house, and let's assume you're going to borrow $200,000 to purchase this house. Well, you may have two choices. You can either get a mortgage for 30 years at a fixed rate, or you could get a mortgage for 15 years at a fixed rate. Now, if I take the 30-year fixed rate payment, it's less, and it's a lighter affliction, if you will. But look at how much I pay in the long run. I borrow my $200,000 and I pay an extra $154,197 in interest for 30 years if I keep it to term. But suppose I'm willing to take on a little more of an affliction. I have higher monthly payments in a 15-year fixed mortgage. In that case, I may have to be careful about how I spend money. I may have to forego certain things like going on trips all the time and other types of sacrifices. But in order to make that more expensive monthly payment in a 15-year fixed mortgage, but look at the long-term benefit. I only pay $57,358 in interest. So it's an affliction, but it's maybe worth doing if I can get through it because the debt overall is paid off much faster. Now, I'll bet you never thought in a presentation from Spiritism you might get financial advice, but there you go. So afflictions, again, can be, in certain cases, worth taking on. And as weird as it might sound at first, we can consider ourselves happy if we're able to pay off, so to speak, something sooner, even if it's a little more uncomfortable. But this only makes sense from the perspective of an immortal spirit that is on a much longer journey. This is why this is a reminder of blessed are the afflicted, for they shall be consoled. Now, blessed are the afflicted, for they shall be consoled sounds like a beatitude from Jesus, but it really isn't. It's actually out of Kardec compiling and summarizing. So this chapter, Blessed are the Afflicted, is based on a kind of general summary of the Beatitudes, not an actual quote from Jesus. If we, again, internalize our understanding of ourselves as immortal spirits, then when we look at our struggles today, not only do we understand that they do serve a purpose, they're not gratuitous, and there can be long-term benefits to them, but that can also perhaps make us feel like calm and resignation, which are as beneficial to the health of the body as to the health of the soul. Whereas envy, jealousy, and ambition, one voluntarily exposes oneself to torture, thus adding to the miseries and anxieties of one's short life. This is talking about the ways in which, when we wallow in envy, jealousy, ambition, why does that person seem to have it easy and I have to struggle so much? We're actually increasing and torturing ourselves even further. And these types of emotional these emotional afflictions wind up being self-inflicted often, and they are a reflection of our inability to really embrace a long-term perspective. Suicide and madness. Spiritism certainly stresses that suicide should never be carried out, that when we engage in this temptation, it is perhaps a reflection that we don't really trust the future at all. We don't trust God. We don't believe, perhaps. Maybe we believe in God, maybe we don't. But when we look at suicide madness, there are 6 reasons, according to an article in Psychology Today, there are 6 reasons why people attempt suicide. The first and the biggest one is depression. Depression is a mental health issue. Depression can be very debilitating. It is curable, but when people are in a state of depression, they can really feel like, I'm never going to get out of this. Psychosis is when people actually have illusions. Voices really are talking to them. It's a form of schizophrenia. Most people, it's actually something like 1% of the human population suffers from schizophrenia. But Spiritism might add to this by saying that if we hear voices in our head, this might also be a sign of mediumship that's not in balance. It could be signs of obsession. It could be signs of spirits trying to manipulate us. Actually, really, all of these could be signs of some kind of spiritual obsession. What about impulsive decision to commit suicide? This can be fueled by drugs, alcohol, some kind of addiction that exasperates certain feelings, and somebody just makes an impulsive decision when they're not fully in their right state of being. Crying out for help. Sometimes people really just are not that determined to commit suicide, but they're still desperate for help. They may make attempts at suicide, and it's a way of saying, please help me. Some people have a philosophical desire to die, which basically means if somebody suffers from say, an illness that they are never, that's a terminal illness, they may decide, I want to have control over my life, and I don't want to keep suffering in this way. So I'm going to make this decision to take myself out. Finally, sometimes people, if they're experimenting with certain drugs, they may just make a mistake. There's oxygen deprivation that I guess some people seem to feel is attractive because it makes them kind of high and lightheaded, and they like that somewhat that state of feeling for a while, but people have accidentally killed themselves doing that as well. But if we think about more the methodical effort of suicide, or if we really any motivation for suicide, if we don't really accept or feel connected to an eternal existence, if we really only believe we just live one life and that's it, then if that's our worldview, then sorrows can indeed feel very overwhelming. And so this stresses that if people do internalize that we have an immortal spirit and that we do go through a future, and Spiritism stresses that when we commit suicide, we are not better off. The message is we are not going to escape. Whatever we're suffering from, whatever emotional turmoil it can be, or physical turmoil, first of all, it won't last forever. Second, committing suicide is possibly going to make it worse, quite likely, and we're not really confronting. We are here on this earth, and probably others as well, to know how to confront, to know how to accept the struggles that we are facing so that we can learn how to overcome them. The last section of chapter 5 is instructions from the spirits. There are 10 psychographed messages, I'm not going to go through all of them. It's too many for this presentation. But if we were to look at what all of them add up to in some way, it could be something like this. These instructions tend to focus on the difference of the journey of an immortal spirit and the future life versus when we are preoccupied with the material existence on earth in some way. There's a message from Augustine of Hippo, who was a bishop of Hippo in northern Africa in the middle of the 4th century until the early part of the 5th century is when he lived. St. Augustine is to this day regarded as one of the most important Christians ever. And what he says is he gets us to think about what is our real purpose of life on earth. And he doesn't mince words. He's basically saying we're not here to be on a picnic, folks. He says, you who come to live in such a place expect tears and bitter pains, and your pains will be sharp and deep. Look up to heaven and bless the Lord for wanting to test you. So again, I know this may sound a little masochistic in tone, but what he's really stressing is that we are here to learn. We cannot avoid suffering. It's just how things are here, part of God's justice, if you will, regardless of what we may think of that. But we're all subject to physical limitations, emotional limitations, and any number of things. The way people misuse their free will. Sometimes people are kind, other times people are enormously cruel and unfair, and so forth. And we have to be able to learn how to navigate our way through all of that and much, much more. One of the things that Augustine emphasizes is that in order to get through all that daunting stuff, faith in the future is key to enduring the present. I would add to that faith in God, faith that what we're going through does serve a purpose. There's a spirit named Samson who was part of the Parisian Society of Spiritist Studies, the first center that was started by Allan Kardec. And he comes back after he discarnates, and he has a message which focuses on that very difficult subject of when loved ones are taken away prematurely. They can be very tempting to think that God is deeply unfair. The first time I experienced death, I was in the 1st grade. It was one of my classmates who was killed. He was playing near a construction site where he shouldn't have been. The second time was not long after that, within a couple of years, where I remember meeting a young girl who passed away not long after I met her from an illness. And I could rattle off some others. But as I mentioned these were people that I remember from my childhood, my teen years, and so forth. Even when I was working in the theater, experienced someone who lost their lives there too, when I was 20. 21. Those kinds of things they affected me, but I can only begin to imagine how they affected the family members of those individuals and how incredibly hard that must have been. Yes, it's overwhelming to go through something like this. It's a parent's worst fear. There's no doubt about it. But Samson really challenges us in this comment. He says, why measure divine justice using the same value as yours? Can you conceive of the master of the world's willing, by mere whim, to inflict cruel punishment on you? Part of what Samson goes on to comment on is it's possible that a life was premature, cut short, as it were, because that spirit was being spared a number of things that they didn't have to go through. Now, do we know? No, we don't know. This is something that I would not recommend bringing this up to anyone who's actually currently suffering in this regard by any means. But at the same time, what this is challenging us to think about is that our perspective now is limited. in the Divine Laws, question 663 does comment about how we are limited in our perspective. So, do we have the whole picture on what our uh, uh, fellow brothers and sisters are going through, what their spiritual journey is? We don't even know our own, let alone somebody else's. So, this is having faith that when someone does pass prematurely, there is some kind of purpose to it, the one that we may never fully understand. But at the same time, this is stressing, and Samson is stressing it's not capricious. Again, he stresses nothing is done without an intelligent goal, and whatever happens, everything has a reason for being. Sometimes it's hard to accept that, but do we begin to really understand that this is what our existence is about? If you look at all the pains that strike you, you will always find a divine reason, a regenerative reason, and your petty interest would be a minor consideration that you would relegate to a secondary place. Well, depending upon what our considerations are, that might sound a little harsh, but at the same time, he's saying to us, we have to really open up our perspective on what our existence is really about. It's not just this life. It's not, and of course, this is just one of several examples that one can point to where Spiritism flatly rejects the point of view that we only live one life, that our existence is subject to the physiology of the brain, consciousness is only based on physical causes, there's no spiritual cause whatsoever, and so forth. Spiritism clearly doesn't accept that. There's also a message called Voluntary Torments from Fenelon. Fenelon was a Catholic bishop in the mid 1600s until the early 1700s, so he was part of the Baroque period. And among other things, he was a respected theologian. He also happened to be the tutor of the grandson of King Louis XIV, actually helped the grandson quite a bit. The grandson did die young of the measles at the age of 29, but Fenelon was credited for helping him. Fenelon stresses that the happiness we pursue here on earth eludes us, that we don't really know what happiness is. He points out that in spite of the vicissitudes that form the inevitable trail of life, people could at least enjoy relative happiness, but they seek it in perishable things. And he mentions material enjoyments. And what we tend not to take much stock in or appreciate are the things that really create enjoyments of the soul. And that if we can do that, it gives us a taste of the future, and as he puts it, imperishable heavenly enjoyments. But we tend to focus on the material. And the material is important in our lives. We learn a lot interacting with the material world. It's not that the material world is bad, but if we worship it in somehow, or if it becomes the only way in which we define ourselves as being worthwhile, then we're really in trouble. Because the material world, the physical world in general, is constantly subject to change. Nothing will stay the same. Everything that we have here is only for a period of time. He emphasizes that seeking peace of heart is the only real happiness on earth. Can we learn to be calm, at peace, again, when we understand what afflictions are about? But he also comments on certain emotions that can really give us a hard time. I mentioned some of these in other parts of this chapter before, too. Envy and jealousy, emotional afflictions that we can really beat ourselves up with if we're full of envy, if we're jealous of others. Again, wallowing and trafficking in those kinds of emotions are a sign that we don't really think much about the future, or perhaps even have any faith that there is a future. Therefore, life in the present seems very unfair. Why does that person over there have what I want, etc.? There's another message from Delphine de Girardin. She was a French writer, the daughter of Sophia Gay, who was also a respected writer in her day. Delphine de Girardin lived in the late 1700s into about 1855. I Interesting about her was that she also actually did seances. And some of the people who participated in her seances were people like Victor Hugo, the French writer. She helped, was, I think, part of that period that finally led to Allan Kardec becoming interested in spirit phenomena. At first, it finally led to the creation of the Spirits book, because she was interested in trying to communicate with the afterlife, with spirits. Um, in her message, she stresses that real misfortune is not in the temporary losses and deprivations we experience here on Earth. That she stresses that real misfortune is when we have to go through some kind of consequence as a result of how we're behaving now. And that's worse or something more than whatever it is that we're doing at the moment. And she says to judge something, it is truly necessary to see what comes after it. Therefore, it is necessary to go beyond one lifetime. She is again stressing that we don't fully understand what we're doing right now or what the real consequences are. If we're behaving badly, then it can obviously lead to all kinds of trouble for us. There's another message from a guardian angel, Bernadine. The question is asked, should we soften or shorten our trials? After all, we keep talking about the importance of affliction. Should we perhaps really bring it on and just go for it, as they say? Well, the answer is, if we're in pain and we're suffering, shouldn't we call a doctor? The point being is that trials are intended to stimulate one's intelligence as well as patience and resignation. If we go through a trial of some kind of affliction, we're not expected to sit there and be passive. If there's something we can do about it, then we should. It's a little bit like a variation on the serenity prayer, which is one of my favorite prayers. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Well, there are times where we certainly can change an affliction, especially if it's a physical one. Go see a doctor if that's what we need. If we're having emotional difficulties, in this day and age, we have so many resources, psychology, therapy, all kinds of things that we could be doing. There's more awareness now about these things than ever before. So we're not expected to just sit around and be passive and feel like I should suffer because it'll make me stronger. There's a question asked of in the Gospel according to Spiritism and other parts of the Spiritist codification, there are messages attributed to St. Louis. St. Louis was Louis the Ninth of France, who lived in the 1200s. He was a very competent, generally considered fair medieval king, one of the more successful medieval kings of his era. He also struggled with internal conflicts in France and also with England and Henry III, who was trying to encroach on territory that France also laid claim to. And Louis XIX was led in both the Seventh and Eighth Crusade. And in the Eighth Crusade, he was captured in uh, the Middle East, and he did die of dysentery. But even so, he's provided many messages in the Spiritist codification that are quite useful. The question is asked, is it permissible to shorten the life of a patient who is suffering without hope for a cure? Well, the answer is, do we know for sure when a person's time is ending, even if their medical case is hopeless? I don't really have time to get into this, but there's famous examples of like Karen Ann Quinlan and Dr. Jack Kevorkian, maybe we could talk about it afterwards, but where they were kind of landmark uh, incidents that led to this question of should we shorten our time or should somebody uh, be allowed to um, engage in euthanasia. And yet, what Spiritism does not recommend we do that at all, put simply. But what he says here is that this hour of grace granted to such a person may be the greatest importance, for you are totally ignorant of the reflections which his or her spirit has been able to make while in the convulsions of agony, and what torments may sudden repentance save him or her. In other words, since we don't know what somebody's going through spiritually speaking, there may be reasons why a little more time on earth, even if they are going through something very difficult, that it might actually be beneficial. This, again, is a very difficult ethical question because if you're witnessing somebody who's suffering a lot, how do you handle that? But nevertheless, he's making the point that the spirit can, we should not attempt to interfere because do we really know the whole story behind what somebody else is going through? At the same time, I do want to stress, as in like the prior point, the prior message, if we can make someone's life easier, we should. We should be compassionate. We should always make an effort to alleviate suffering when that is possible. So even if somebody's in this situation, yes, we can do whatever we can to try to make them as comfortable as possible. But that's different than if we actually deliberately end that person's life. I'm going to wrap up with just 3 general summaries. One of the general points of this chapter I would like to suggest is that we shouldn't fixate on the notion that afflictions are just about misery and punishment, that really our afflictions, whatever they may be, are opportunities for spiritual progress. Even when the physical body goes through all kinds of challenges, the spirit can benefit from that. And we also always need to remember that our afflictions are always temporary. This is a quote from item 14, which is under the subject of suicide and madness, which says, calm and resignation in earthly life and faith in the future give the spirit a serenity, which is the best antidote against, in this case, suicide and madness. But I would say, really, against anything, no matter what affliction we're going through. If we can truly have calm and resignation and put our trust in the future, then it can help us to cope with the present. And finally, a nice quote in item 15. What is the human existence when compared to eternity, if not less than a single day? Again, as immortal spirits, everything we're going through right now, no matter how big it is, overwhelming it can feel, it is just a little pinprick, and it too will pass. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Wonderful lecture. I think
Thank you.
part of what the doctrine invites us to do is to, besides loving one another, instruct one another, right? So very informative, especially the note that you ended on in terms of suffering being temporary. But if it's okay with you, I would like to open up for questions. I know it's getting late, 9:30 where you are, but 5 to 10 minutes, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
So guys, feel free to unmute, give your thanks to Peter, or make any comments or ask any questions in this last couple of minutes.
So Peter, while people are, getting their questions in order there, I just want to say thank you so much again, as published for the talk. Really, really great talk. And I really like when you touch on the point that, that's that occurred in the past must be paid, and how enlightening is that the Spiritist doctrine gives us the stuff to endure that, but also tells us that not all debts need to be paid with pain. Some can be paid with love, right? So it's at the same time it gives us the resilience to go through things we cannot avoid, as you said, right? But also gives us the opportunity to circumvent some of the pain by actively working um, uh, in the vineyard, right? In Christ's vineyard. So, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, how we pay off debts, for instance, can be very relative. Certainly the more proactive we are, once we have certain awareness of it, the more we can take steps that alleviate something that might wind up being worse than if we choose to avoid it. So, again, it's an invitation to be proactive.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see Ana, Joana, Marga, Adriana, Marcela, Glaucia, Luis. Feel free, guys.
Just want to thank you, Peter. That's really, very inspiring.
Thank you.
It really was, yeah.
I have a question, Peter, just while people are
Okay.
really encouraged to pose questions. For someone who is, say, dealing with a very serious illness, right? You mentioned
Right.
folks with terminal illness, or perhaps even not an illness, but something that they frame is serious in their lives, whether it is an abandonment, someone they love that no longer is in this world, a relationship that didn't work out. What advice would you give against desperation in times like this?
Advice to that person, or well, it gets into that question, is there help available? Absolutely. There's always help available, but we have to want the help. And that's the challenging thing. Sometimes when people are very full of sorrow, they can feel like uh, it's never going to end and there's no solution. But at the same time, every one of us, when we go through some kind of struggle like that, we have to be willing to try and seek help. Fundamentally, we have to want help. Unfortunately, sometimes, when we think about the journey that a spirit goes on, one may have to go through the consequences of not seeking help more than once before they finally say, maybe I should seek help. How do we reach somebody if we can? Should we try? Absolutely. If there's something we can do. I can think of someone I used to know who was very smart in many ways, did struggle with addiction, went through periods where that person was okay and did get a lot of help, but ultimately suffered some real serious emotional setbacks and loss, and that person finally succumbed. But it might have been the best that person could have done. That person, I think, probably did accomplish some things in that life, even though it didn't end as positively that way. But when people don't get through, so to speak, I don't want to use the word failure because it's not a failure. But if somebody succumbs to depression or despair and they either directly or indirectly shorten their life, it's possible from this point of view of reincarnation that they've tried many times before to take their lives, and this time they resisted a little bit more than they did in the past. And that can be a victory. May not feel like a victory, but in the grand, again, from the perspective of a spirit on a much longer journey, maybe they did about as good as they could do.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, right? Because I think when we hear about the afflicted, we're very quick to want to come to the rescue, right? So,
Sure.
yeah, what I'm hearing is, obviously scanning for opportunities to find those hidden misfortunes, but at the same time, not imposing our will, right? Respecting another's will and waiting for them
Yeah,
to be ready.
I mean, it all depends. Sometimes people do benefit from interventions, but generally speaking, and certainly if we see an opportunity to help somebody, then yes, if there's something we can do, we should. But there are times when people just don't want to be helped. Doesn't matter what you say to them. It doesn't matter. They will find a reason to avoid it, which means what? Whatever their attitude is and whatever drives them, that has to run its course. And it may be very frustrating to others, but sometimes people just, they put the blinders on and they keep charging ahead, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes it's the best to wait and say a prayer, right? Anybody else? For Peter, guys? Have a couple minutes. All right, sounds like everybody learned the lessons. They're ready to go out and practice, Peter. So on that note, can you finish the meeting with a prayer for us, Peter? Again, thank you so much for your
Sure.
time.
Okay. We thank you, dear God, for life. We thank you for all the opportunities we have. We thank you for our talents. We thank you for our capacity to develop our intelligence. We thank you for this opportunity to overcome whatever challenges come our way. May we have the strength to get through each and every day, but also to appreciate everything that life has to offer. May we do our best to practice mindfulness, to have perseverance, to do our best to be at peace and to have serenity with whatever direction life takes us in at the moment. Please bless our families. Please bless our friends. Please bless our neighbors and our communities. Please bless this country. Please bless all countries. And may humanity throughout the planet be able to receive the help that it needs. And may all of us embrace the long term. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. So be it. All right. Thank you so much again, Peter. Hope
Thank
everyone
you. Thank you.
Thank you
has a
again.
good rest of
Thank
the
you.
day.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
Have a good night.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you. Have a good
Bye.
night, everybody.
Bye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.